I on? Yes. Good morning, guys. The slides, if you want to follow along or check them later, are online here. You can find me on Twitter, Google+. I don't really do Facebook very much. So, to get right into it, I've been doing this for a very long time now. 18 years or so, I guess. Even longer than that. I used to do lots of sort of pre-web hacking on IRC, Gopher, and back in the 90s, late 80s, I guess even, I was working on BBS software in Canada. So I've been doing this stuff for my entire life, basically. But when the web hit, I got very interested. I saw the early web, which looked like that. You had this uppercase HTML tags with a bogus CGI bin, Perl counter usually, and it was a mess. And performance-wise, it was terrible. Having to fork and exec a Perl binary on every request just to show a little counter that shows how many times the page has been hit just didn't work. So I wanted something better, faster. I wanted more dynamic web pages. I didn't want to have to fork and exec a heavy interpreter on every request. And there was something called SSI back then. This stood for server-side includes. I guess we still have them, but nobody really uses them anymore. It's mod include, I guess, in Apache. You couldn't do very much with them. So I wanted a more powerful system for dynamic content creation built into the web server. So I took the model of SSI to begin with, and this is PHP version 1, circa 1994, with the PHP expressions embedded inside HTML comment tags. And you can see a little bit of what was to come in this. I didn't have variables. The ones that were there that looked like variables, like num entries, these were actually magic variables that were filled in internally. So whenever you would do an SQL query, I would create this num entries variable. And exec result is another variable you can see there. Whenever you would execute a command, I would always put the result into exec result. You couldn't define your own variables. You couldn't do anything interesting with this. So, PHP version 1. I got really tired of having to put stuff inside HTML comment tags. You couldn't really do code blocks with this. So I started playing around with Flex and Bison and wrote the first real interpreter for PHP, which looked like this. So this is PHP version 2. Although I never really got to 2, actually. It was like 1.99n or something, I think was my last release. You could see I started using this bracket equal or bracket question mark tag. This comes out of SGML. SGML is what HTML is based on, and SGML has this PI tag, process instruction tag, which was that. I was supposed to label my process instruction if I had read the whole SGML spec, but it's 10,000 pages long, so I didn't. And nobody else was using PI tags back then, so I grabbed it and said, this is mine, which really pissed off the XML folks later on when they came along and said, hey, we need to put XML inside HTML documents, but everyone's using PHP and it breaks if we put them in. And so they weren't happy with the fact that I hadn't labeled my instruction. I still don't think it's fair. I was there first. They can find their own damn tag. I should also have read a bit further because I was supposed to close with question mark bracket as well, but I got that wrong as well. I didn't have curly braces, but other than that, this doesn't look that different from the PHP that we have today. If you fast forward 10 years, that same piece of code might look more like this. It's all object-y and has all kinds of fancy things in there. Honestly, I still prefer that. It's direct to the point. I can read it without having to figure out the various methods and classes and what these magic things all do. So how did we get here? So why did people start picking this kind of broken, I mean, I got many, many things wrong in PHP 2. Yet, it really, really took off. even before PHP 3. And the web grew and grew and grew, and PHP grew right along with the web. And I think one of the reasons is that I focused on the ecosystem more than the language from the very beginning. Remember at the beginning I said, look, I need a better way of building dynamic content embedded into the web server. It wasn't so much I was thinking, I need a better language for solving this problem. It has nothing to do with the language. I needed a better environment for solving the problem, which included the whole ecosystem. How are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to serve up the content? What's our server? What's our back end? How is an ISP going to offer this to their users? Like all these things are things you have to think about if you want an end-to-end solution that people can actually use. And LAMP wasn't an accident, right? I actually thought a little bit about how this thing was going to be used and how it was going to be deployed and how fast it would be once you put all the pieces together. Also thought a little bit about ISPs. What do ISPs care about? Especially in the late 90s, ISPs were trying to shove as many users as they could onto as few machines as possible, right? Lots and lots of shared hosting. Thousands and thousands of domains on a single shared host. And what do they have to worry about? Well, they have to worry about one user on the system doing crazy things that will take the other 5,000 users that are sharing that same Apache instance down. We didn't have VMs back then. You couldn't really segregate them well. So you had to kind of rely on other people not to screw you over. And an ISP doesn't like that. They don't like the fact that they have to rely on dumb users not to screw over other dumb users. And then they call in and ask dumb questions to support, and it's a nightmare. It's one of the reasons Mod Perl never took off. Mod Perl was way too powerful. With Mod Perl, you could go in and you can completely reconfigure the web server. You can change everything about how Apache is going to take the request and serve things up. And you can hook in even before it figures out which domain is going to get served up and how this path is going to get translated to a file that's going to get served up. So you could write a hook that would take other people's requests and redirect them to your web server. And there's no real way of defeating that. You couldn't really tell Mod Perl, well, don't be powerful, don't do that, because it was designed to do that, but it wasn't designed for a shared environment. So ISPs couldn't offer it. With things like CPU limits, memory limits, and things like that in PHP, an ISP could, to some extent at least, nail down what users could do and how much damage they could do, even if they deliberately tried to just chew up CPU time with a while one loop, for example. It'll get killed off after a while. So ISPs really like that. And I think the second point was scale. And the really important part here is being able to scale down. Scaling up is, I'm not going to say it's easy, it's hard, but it's kind of expected. And as engineers, that's the problem we think about. How are we going to scale this thing to thousands and thousands of requests per second? And that's what I thought about. My whole goal when I started this was to serve up web requests faster than I could do with CGI Perl at the time. But sometimes we lose track of the fact that everyone starts pretty small. The weekend warriors, they're the ones that are actually creating the interesting content. They're the ones that put stuff together. And 1 in a million of those will suddenly take off, and they'll suddenly need to worry about scaling. But there are millions of the really, really low-end solutions, people that have an interesting idea, want to get it online. How are they going to do that with the least friction possible? And that's hard. It's really hard to build something that is approachable by somebody who does not have a lot of experience in this stuff. They have a lot of experience in another field, and that's the field they're trying to bring to the web. But giving them a solution that they can just sort of grasp and get going with quickly is not easy. Because scaling down is hard. Making it easy, making what is inherently pretty complicated very, very easy for people is not easy. And doing both, scaling up to something the size of Yahoo and Facebook, and at the same time scaling down to the weekend warrior who doesn't know anything, that's almost impossible. I remember in the early days, 99, I was working for IBM in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. And I was on the WebSphere team. And if there was ever an example of something that doesn't scale down, it's WebSphere. I don't know if you guys have ever had to experience WebSphere, but it took me over a week to get my first Hello World application up and running in WebSphere. It was not easy. And I asked for the documentation, and someone came with a cart of books and CDs, and it was just massive. PHP still has the simplest Hello World out there of any language or any framework, anything, right? You put Hello World in a text file, put it on your web server, it says Hello World. Right? That's it. No echoes, no system print crap, no including any output libraries, none of that stuff. You write Hello World in a text file and you put it on your server. It shouldn't be harder than that, because what else could you possibly mean when you put Hello World into a text file and put it on your document root, right? That's the obvious, simple thing that your system should do. And most other languages will just give you a syntax error for that. All right, so as the web grew, this ecosystem started to evolve. APIs started to spring up. And lately, in the last couple of years, what's been really cool is that we've started getting meta APIs. There are two big ones out there right now. One's called YQL from Yahoo. There's another one called QL.io from eBay. I spent 7 years at Yahoo, so I know the YQL one a little bit better. But what you can do with this is you can basically access any API in the world with something that looks a little bit like SQL. So a simple example here, select star from first names, look up where name equals Rasmus. And it gives me a little bit of information about the name, where it's from, if it's male or female. Irish first name, right? When you combine these two things, a very approachable ecosystem for building web applications quickly, plus these meta APIs that let you access pretty much any information on the web. And also rather difficult algorithms like analyzing a first name to figure out where it's from and whether it's male or female. That's something that would take you a long time to figure out how to do yourself. Or even if you find some libraries you can download, it's a heck of a lot easier if you can do it in a one-liner from your PHP script and just go, okay, let's figure out if this is male or female, and let's move on from there, right? Stuff like getting the weather. Select star from weather underground forecast where location equals London. Not hard. By the way, you guys have very strange temperatures for London in February. I live in California. It was warmer here yesterday than it was at home. Very odd. Again, select star from Flickr photo search, where tags equals London, sort by interestingness. And some of the APIs, you actually do need to sign up for an API key. But in all of them, you can just say, and API key equals, and all these APIs will also work, even if you have to register to use some of them. So you take this easy access to web-based APIs, get lots of photos. Then you add a little bit of CSS. Right? That's exactly the same script, 3 lines of PHP, add a bit of CSS3 that just randomizes the position. If we reload it, you can see. Does some rounded corners and all this stuff, all in CSS. And that means that any idiot out there can write very, very impressive looking websites without a whole lot of fighting the technology and fighting the tools. Because what it's really about is actually solving people's problems. The technology doesn't matter, right? The users of these sites, they don't care how you wrote your application. They care that when they click on that add to shopping cart, buy, that it's quick and it's safe and it just works, right? All the crap behind the scenes is completely irrelevant. And that's why we're building stuff, isn't it? Is to solve problems for people. It's not to sit and play with our hammer. Because that's just, I know it's sort of in our own little circle, we all love to debate which hammer is better and all this crap, but it doesn't matter, right? Find a tool that solves the problem, solve problem for people, and make the world a better place with the web. That should be the goal. All right, this year, what are we doing? Well, one thing we're doing is we're dealing with a crappy thing called hash DOS. Anyone heard about hash DOS? Really? It's like 3 people in the room? Okay, a little more. It's a little hard to see. Okay, but still, very, very few people know what hash DOS is. Okay, I'll explain it to you. So inside just about every language in the world, there are hash tables. So when you put stuff into an array, you have keys and you have values. In order to look up the key quickly, we will hash that key and try to get a nice, even distribution across a bunch of hash buckets. So we have this hash table. We hash the key so we can do just with a single quick hash, we can go and find the correct bucket. Occasionally, we'll have a hash collision so that 2 different keys will actually hash to the same bucket. If that happens, we add a link. It's a linked list, how it's implemented internally in PHP and in most systems. And once you have a hash collision, it takes you 1 extra memory dereference to get to that collided bucket here. And if you have too many of them, the system gets a little slower because then you have to jump through 3 or 4 pointers in C to actually get your information out of that bucket. Generally, it's not a problem. We use a hashing function in PHP called djbx33a. Sounds very, very fancy. But all it really does is it multiplies by 33 and adds the character, the value of the character at each position in the key. And it iterates through that. It looks complicated here because we've unrolled the loops in order to make it compile down into better assembly language, essentially. But if we rewrite this in PHP, you can see how simple it is. So we start with a hash value, and we run through each character, multiply by 33, add the character value at each position in the key string. And that's our hash. Now, unfortunately, it's a very, very simple hash because we need it to be really fast because we have to hash all the time in PHP. So we need a dead simple one. Multiply by 33 is good because it's just shift left 5 times plus 1, right? Shift left is times 32. Add the hash again, you get 33. So it's 1 shift, 1 add operation to do the hashing. Now, we could put in a much more complicated hashing algorithm. But that also means it would speed down PHP by a lot. And we didn't do this to be cryptographically safe. We did it for hashing performance. But that means that colliding it is not that hard. And it happens that if you take keys 1024, 2048, multiples of 1024, and calculate the hash, you get the same hash value for all of those. Now, there are lots of other strings. There are lots of other combinations that will hash to that same one. So if you sit down and actually generate a bunch of hash keys that all hash to the same thing, and you send a post request to a PHP server with all those keys, so 1024, 2048, 3072, and it's not just hundreds, you need thousands and thousands, right? If you send about 30,000 of these to a PHP server, it can take PHP 30 to 40 seconds to actually build the post array in memory because on every single time the first one is fast. The second one, collide, link once. It's pretty fast too. The third one, fourth one, that's fine. But the number 31,999 has to link through 31,999 links, right? And the one before did one less, did one less, did one less, right? So it becomes a huge number as we're building basically this collision line here. So our hash table is completely broken because all we're getting is one huge linked list. Now, in normal everyday operations, you'll never hit this, but the bad guys can craft requests like this and basically take down a server. So how do we stop it? Well, in PHP 5.3.10 and higher, we now have max input vars. So that basically limits you to 1,000 post variables, get variables, cookie, whatever, right? 1,000 of these. And 1,000 PHP can do no problem. Even if they all collide, it's not an issue. But there are other places. For example, if you take user data, like a JSON blob, for example, they could embed a colliding array inside a JSON blob. So there are other places in PHP that are application specific where this might also be an issue. So it's still a good idea to be aware of it for other parts of your application. Anywhere where you're creating arrays from user data, you have to be careful. And you may want to put your own limits in and say, well, look, there should never be more than 1,000 elements in this array. If you leave it unlimited, people can possibly hash DOS your application. Now, we could solve it by adding a randomizer in the hash. So on every request, we use a different random seed for the hash function. The problem is that there are many things in PHP where these hash tables span the requests. For example, in APC, we cache function and class hash tables in shared memory, and they're actually cached with the hash keys. So if we changed on every request, we wouldn't be able to use APC at all in this case because we wouldn't be able to find these things because the hashing algorithm or the seed would be different and the hash keys wouldn't match across requests. So then we could do it on a sort of per server or per startup, as in when you restart your PHP server, we could grab a random seed. But even then, there are also opcode cache, APC included, where you can actually dump your shared memory to disk and then reload it after a server restart. That would be broken in that case. And there are other areas too where there are hash keys that actually get saved. So we haven't come up with a better way of doing this yet that's not going to break a lot of existing code. So for now, this is what we have, max input vars, plus me trying to teach you guys that you need to worry about it a little bit, not that much, a little bit in your own applications as well. All right, enough of the boring stuff. Some new, or newish, cool stuff. I really like these two new extensions. One's libevent, and the other is 0MQ. Libevent lets you write an event-driven server in PHP, and 0MQ is a really, really cool technology that I like to relate to SQLite. So 0MQ, the MQ stands for message queuing, obviously. It's really not an MQ, it's really a socket library. Just like SQLite is really not a database. It's kind of a database front end to the file system, essentially, but there's no server involved. Same with 0MQ, there's no server. It's basically a socket library that lets you do one-to-one, one-to-many, all kinds of different interesting configurations of socket communications. Combine that with something like libevent, and you can write some kick-ass event-driven servers that can sit there and serve up thousands and thousands of concurrent requests. And it's not that hard. So there's an event-driven server here. Might look a little bit complicated, but really it's just setting up where we're going to listen. We're going to listen on 127.0.0.1, port 5555. Then we define a callback function. So what are we going to do when we get a request on that socket? So here I have a static variable called messages that I'm just going to increment, so just incrementing a counter. And once my counter hits 10, I'm going to exit my event loop. Then I register my callback function doing event set and add my event and go into my loop. So basically now this server just sits here in this event-based loop call. Right? There's no looping through PHP, anything. It's all sitting there in C, basically, just waiting for a request. Whenever it gets a request, it's going to call out, and it's going to run this closure, or this function that I fed it on every request. So you have a very, very fast server that just sits there and runs a bit of PHP code every time it gets a connection. The client, to talk to it, is 3 lines. Connect, and send a message. So send, hello there, and then we can chain the receive to receive the response and print out the response. You can do some very nifty things with that. So if you're playing with something like Node.js for an event-driven server and you're struggling writing JavaScript and this whole sort of take turns approach that Node uses, that take, hey, you get a slice now, now you get a slice, now you get a slice, now you get a slice, and you have to worry about that. It's a lot of things to try to juggle in your mind. It's one of these things, it's really kind of cool to sit and play with the hammer, but there might be a quicker way of getting the same effect with what you already know. So have a look at libevent for that. Another thing I've been playing with, I think Ian is here. Ian Barber wrote this extension. He's at the back. SVM. I really, really like SVM. It stands for Support Vector Machine. And it's basically a interesting machine learning mechanism where you give it a bunch of data, a bunch of vectors. And that defines, so maybe it's spam you're trying to define, or there are many different things. If you can somehow get numeric vectors that say, if it has 1 here, 3 here, 2 here, -1, -1, -1, then that's spam. If you have other vectors, that's not spam. And you train the machine. You give it all this information. You give it a data set, essentially, and with some results. So an observed data set of spam and not spam. And then all these vectors are in the model. Then you can load that model, and you can run predict. So then you get a new set of vectors for a new event. You say, predict which bucket this thing falls in. And it's really nice that all this math that you'd have to sit and read a book, it's just in a library, and with a couple of PHP calls, you can train your model. So you can keep adding new stuff. So you might, for a while, be in the learning phase where you basically just have humans categorize things. Is this fraud, not fraud, whatever. Based on the various things you know about this particular event, you categorize it. And then after a while, as long as you then record all these things in your model as you're going, eventually you can start doing a predict. And eventually you might get rid of that human that's sitting there determining whether this is fraud or not. Because at a certain point, maybe your data set and your model is intelligent enough that it knows it by itself. And the way it works is, it's if you take it in 2 dimensions, you have an X and a Y. And you say, if everything up in this area up here is fraud, and everything in this area of the graph is not fraud, then you look at the X and Y, and based on where it falls in those 2 areas, you can automatically know, hey, this is fraud, this is not fraud, based on previous events, right? So you take that 2-dimensional approach and you expand it to n dimensions. And that's basically all it does. It draws these hyperplanes. So you take, instead of just having an x, y, you might have 8 dimensions. And that's not something we can handle in our heads. But the math basically draws these complicated hyperplanes and identifies clusters. And then it categorizes all these things in the different clusters. And based on that, it knows whether this event looked like other events. And it's interesting math, and it's actually much, much simpler than other mechanisms out there for it. And now that you have a PHP window into it, you're golden. So thanks, Ian, for that. All right, 5.4. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the new things that are in 5.4 that's going to be coming out soon, hopefully within the month. Well, we're at the end of the month, so maybe next month, but sometime in March, I'm sure we'll get it out. We've improved fast CGI, memory handling, bunch of things on the list here. The quiet operator is faster. Empty hashes, so when you do array, bracket, bracket, that used to be slower than it needed to be. We've removed a bunch of features, which there are a few here that could affect you. Magic quotes is a little scary to remove because it does protect naive users from SQLI in some circumstances. I mean, we've removed it because it doesn't protect everyone and it's not the right way of protecting it. But people who have never thought about SQL injection are just randomly lucky that PHP's magic quotes were on by default in previous versions, and it actually took care of it. Now that it's gone, and if someone upgrades blindly without checking anything, then there could be more SQLI out there in the world, which isn't good, but at a certain point, we also have to move on, and that's what we're doing. Y2K compliance, hopefully that's not going to bite anybody anymore. Still one of my favorite features ever. You wouldn't believe how many emails I would get in 1999, even back in 1998, asking if PHP was Y2K compliant. Which doesn't make any sense, right? Because it's the application that you write that you need to worry about PHP itself. But they wanted an answer, right? They wanted, their boss has asked them, please ensure that all whole technology stack is Y2K compliant. So I get this form email that says, hey, are you Y2K compliant? I was like, And until we added this configuration switch, I didn't have a good answer. I would give this long rambling response about it. Well, it's not us, it's you, blah, blah, blah. Nobody wants to hear that. They want an action item, right? Y2K compliance equals on in your PHP ini file. Problem solved. And they were happy. They loved that. And the thing that it actually did one tiny little thing to the set cookie command. Because back in set cookie, or cookies came out of Netscape. And Netscape had a cookie spec. And all their example uses 2-digit dates, but the spec itself, or the wording around it, talked about 4-digit dates. So the people who actually read the spec, the browser implementers that read the spec would use 4-digit dates. The browser guys that just skimmed the examples used 2-digit dates. And in the early days of browsers, there were two types. There was the 2-digit and the 4-digit, and they didn't kind of interact, which was a mess. And you could switch PHPs from 2 to 4 by turning on Y2K compliance. But all the browsers now understand 4-digit years, so it's not necessary anymore. Traits is new. Traits can confuse people very, very easily. Please just try to keep in mind this phrase. It's compiler-assisted copy and paste. If you think about it too much, you'll get really, really confused. Don't think about it. Just think about the fact that you can copy and paste blocks of code into your classes, right? Same you would do with your editor. You go, hey, I need this block of code from this class. I need it here. You'd copy and paste it from in your editor over here. It's exactly the same thing you can use just with a shortcut here by saying use the trait. So here I have a trait called singleton. I have 2 different classes. The 2 different classes have nothing to do with each other, so they shouldn't inherit from each other in any way whatsoever. And having a base singleton class would be idiotic, right? So these 2 different classes that happen to want to use the same pattern can both say use singleton, and they'll both have the code that is defined in the singleton. Now, these are traits as opposed to mixins because we handle conflicts, or actually it's more accurate to say we don't handle conflicts. We give you a way of handling the conflict. Instead of just taking the second one and saying, well, this one wins, like other languages do, we say, well, here's a conflict. Both of these traits that you wanted to use implement the same method. We can't have that. Tell me which method you want to use. So there's a conflict resolution syntax that you can do when you do use. You can say use this instead of that instead of that, alias this method to this. You only need that if you're using multiple traits and they might conflict. We've also added the short array syntax. So you can just do square brackets to create arrays. Speeds up your typing a little bit. You also have function array dereferencing. So you can call a function that returns an array and dereference that array right on the function call. Instance method calls. This basically means that you can create an instance of an object and call methods on it in the same, on the same line here. Now be a little bit careful with this stuff because it can get messy pretty fast. I mean, this one you can follow right. I mean, we instantiate foo here, right? We set x to 20. It's going to call set x, sets this x to 20, right? And then we get x back. So we get 20 out of it, right? Not too bad. But if we start also adding function array dereferencing, so now instantiated foo2, we set x to an array, right? And we get x. And get x is going to return the array, and then we get array index 2 here, right? So 0, 1, 2. So 20 is what we're going to get back. But it takes a little bit of reading to figure out that this is going to return 20. And we can go a little crazier, and we can add instance method array dereferencing. So here, we instantiate foo, we give it a nested array. Remember, we have our shortcut. So we have one array inside another array here, and then we dereference it right away, right? So array element 1 is an array itself, and then index 0 on that array is 4. So that's what we're going to get back from this line of code. I'd really prefer if you split this over a couple of lines. I know lots of people really want to just string everything together and write everything in 2 lines of code, but I don't consider this readable. And many, many times, if you're doing instance method function calls, why wasn't that a static call on that object? Why do you need to instantiate the object and throw it away right away? That doesn't make any sense to me. There are times when the constructor does something useful. If the constructor actually does something you need, then yes, I can see you might need to instantiate it to call the constructor and then call another method. But many times I see people wanting this that don't have anything in their constructor. They just don't understand static method calls, I guess. All right, another new thing in 5.4 is we are doing some magic with $this inside closures that are defined inside a class. So here I have a class foo. I have a function that says return me a printer function, getPrinter, which returns a closure which does an uppercase first on this prop. Right? So when I call it new foo, I give it bar, getPrinter, and then I call the closure that came back, and it's going to uppercase the B on bar, and I get capital bar coming back. Simple enough. The one thing that might not be completely obvious is that you actually now have a function that is outside the class that has access to the private property prop. Which is a little sort of, wait a second. I'm calling a function that can see private properties inside a class. But the idea is, since you're the idiot who defined this closure inside the class, then hopefully you knew what you were doing, and you're leaking this closure outside. We're assuming that was your intent. You can even rebind it. So you can say, start A, new foo bar, B, foo pickle, call func bar like before, but then you can say, I want to bind this func to the B instance instead of the A instance where it came from. And now when I call it again, it'll now give me a pickle. I'm not quite sure why you would need that, to be honest. I'm sure some framework folks have these long explanations of why this is essential. They couldn't build their framework without it. I'm skeptical. Static closures. So basically, if you don't want your closures to have access to $this, if you declare them static, then they won't. You try to call it, and you have this inside it, you'll get a fatal error saying using this when not in object context. We have a callable type hint. Basically, if something is expecting something that's callable, you can type hint it's a callable. Type hinting in PHP is a bit of a touchy subject. Basically, the rule is that we have type hints for things that are not interchangeable. Something like callable, anything else you pass it in is going to completely break when you try to call it like a function, if it's not callable. Now, people want scalar type hints, but the problem is that they'll say, well, int foo, and I pass it in a string containing 1, 2, 3. Those two are perfectly interchangeable. It shouldn't break the application just because I didn't cast my parameter to an int first. So we try to stay away from type hinting interchangeable parameters, but we do allow type hints for non-interchangeable parameters like callable. We also have a built-in web server in 5.4. Mostly the goal for this, or the motivation for this, was to fix our test cases. We have all these weird tricks to try to test PHP in a web server context. We can't rely on the user's web server, so we run this CGI thing that opens this port, and we try to hit that, pretend it's a web server. It's a huge hack. And for testing, you want to test as close as possible to your production environment. So this brings us a little closer to writing better tests. Please, please, please don't use it as your production web server. It's probably slow. I haven't measured it. It's probably insecure. I haven't checked. So just don't use it as production, please. We've added binary notation, just like you have 0x. Now have a 0B for binary. Very simple feature. Error messages are slightly improved. It's hard to even spot the difference. The top one is the new version. The bottom one is the PHP 5.3 and older version. The difference is that we now tell you the actual token value. Before we just said unexpected T string, which is the name of the token in the parser. That was unexpected in this expression here. Now we show you what the token actually is, so it helps a little bit. Now we have a new warning or a new notice on array to string conversion. So I'm sure you've seen websites and even your own code that'll suddenly spit out array, right? Because you try to echo an array directly, right? It converted to string, an array converted to a string in PHP, it just is array, which isn't a super useful conversion, obviously. And pretty much any time you end up doing that conversion, it's because there's a bug in your code. So we now tell you about it with a notice. We've had quite a few complaints about this in people testing 5.4 because of things like array intersect. So array intersect will compare two arrays, and it'll find all the items in the first array that also appear in the second array. So in this case, we do array intersect of A and B. Element 3 here is the only one that appears in both, so it returns that saying this particular element, which is index 2 in the first array, value 3 is the intersection of those two arrays. Now, array intersect, array diff, array assoc intersect, there's like 4 or 5 different functions that do similar things. They don't work with nested arrays. They have never worked with nested arrays. It'd be nice if they did, but they don't. But people still feed nested arrays to it. So they do stuff like this. They feed it 1, 2, and then 3 is inside a nested array, and again 3 in a nested array. So it is actually, that would be the intersection. This array containing 3 would be the intersection. And people will run this code and say, well, I get the right result, because what comes out at the end after all my notices is actually here. Right? It found there was an array. It gave me the right answer. What's with all these notices? The problem is it's not comparing what you think it's comparing. And I can illustrate that by doing this. Instead of having 3 inside the array, I put 999 in the second array here. And if we look after all the warnings, it still tells me that the intersection is this array containing a 3, which doesn't exist in the second one. And to make it even more obvious what's happening, check out this last example, right? So I have a nested array in the first one. I have a string containing the word array in the second one. This is going to intersect as well, right? This is going to give me the same answer. So obviously the function is not doing what you think it's doing. That's why you get a notice. And we had a bunch of people's test environments, Drupal's test environment completely blew up because of this. Because many, many times they actually had empty arrays. And the test was okay because the array was empty in both cases, so it was actually correct, the answer, but it was also comparing it to any array or even the string array, so it was a very fragile test they were doing. So if you start seeing these notices when you upgrade to 5.4, check your code. It's not a bug. It's your code. We have a JSON interface. You can implement JSON serializable if you want some control over what happens when someone tries to JSON encode your object. If you implement this interface and implement this method called JSON serialize, then you have full control of what's going to come out if someone tries to JSON encode you. Then we have some new options on JSON encode, pretty print, a bunch of other things, minor features. And there's a bunch more. Davy Shafiq at 12 o'clock is going to go into much more depth on all the new things in 5.4 if you're interested. So go check out his talk. Here's some small list of some of the things that are even more than this. There's a bunch of new things. This one here might be important to some people, that the short echo syntax is now always enabled, even if short tags are off, because it doesn't actually conflict because the name of the PI tag in this case is equals. Nobody else uses a PI tag called equals, so it's not conflicting. So it doesn't need to be tied to short tags. All right. One of the things I have sort of resigned myself to doing this year is trying to get some more people to contribute to PHP. We need folks testing release candidates. I've been harping on people and companies to please, please, please test. It really annoys me when they get around to upgrading, big company gets around to upgrading to the latest PHP release 6 months after we released it, and they start complaining about all the things that broke. Like, it'd be really nice if they had complained about these things 6 months before the release, not 6 months after, because 6 months after doesn't do us much good. Yes, we break stuff. We don't have very many resources. There are probably, I don't know, 15 to 20 of us that regularly contribute to sort of the guts of PHP and the core pieces of PHP. It's not a lot of people, right? There are huge, huge companies out there relying almost entirely on PHP. At the very least, test our release candidates when we make it available and see if something breaks and complain before we release it and help us fix things. So qa.php.net is where to find the release candidates. It also lets you find the results of people's make test runs. You can check to see if a test that's failing for you has failed for other people. Track down failed tests for us, please. Look at the failures from other people. Look at why it's failing on your system, and send us a decent bug report, hopefully with a patch that says, here's why it failed, here's how to fix it. Either fix the code or the test. It's not that hard. PHP test cases are, on purpose, really, really simple. It's not big unit tests. It's not complicated at all. It's a piece of PHP code, and it's an expect block. It's like, this is the code I want to run, and this is the expected output. That's it. You can copy and paste the little tiny piece of code you think doesn't work. You can paste in the expected output, and there's a good test case that says, okay, once this is fixed, this test should start passing. That's all there is to it. File better bug reports, please. We get a lot. I checked the numbers the other day. 60% of all reported bug reports are not bugs, which is kind of crappy to have to go through all of those. Another 30% of them just don't make any sense at all. And then so we're dealing with less than 10% of actual things that we can dig into and have a look at and say, hey, this might actually be a bug. That's helpful. But there's 90% crud that just slows us down because we have to read sometimes pages and pages of stuff. And you're looking at it going, oh man, this, yeah, fine. Then you copy it to your own server, you run it, you figure out that he has a syntax error somewhere and he had warnings turned off, or who knows. It's always something really, really stupid. And when we have so few people working on this, please don't waste our time with dumb bug reports. gcov. The gcov website has nice test coverage. If you go to it, you can go into 5.4, for example, and you can see coverage in the various components. Should we pick one that actually has decent coverage? Probably not. How about exif? That doesn't have great coverage. You can dig right into the file, and you can go through and you can see the blue is stuff that's covered by a test, the red is stuff that isn't. So if you're looking for things to write tests for, you need to be able to read C a little bit to the point where you can figure out that, hey, we need an exif file that has this particular tag in it in order to test if it's handling that correctly, because there's no test that covers these different format tags or whatever they are, right, in here. So that would be one place to start if you're looking for something to do. Back. The other place, if you're just looking for something to do, if you have 15 minutes, you're bored, something I added the other day, go to bugs.php.net/random. It'll give you a random open bug. And sometimes all we need is for someone else to look at the code and say, well, this bug report is dumb because he misunderstood this. Other times, like this one, FF5 ref sample on Windows. I have no idea what that means, but if this means something to you, and you have a Windows installation with whatever FFI is, I have no idea. Is it? Oh, right. Yeah. Now I remember that. But so in many cases, it's not useful. You just go to the next one, right? So screw that. Don't do Windows. Next, random bug. Also Windows. Screw that. I don't do Windows. Next one, Windows. There might be a pattern here. All right, so on the fourth try, I got a non-Windows one, it looks like. And nobody has commented on it. It was opened in November. So this is one of these where if you know a little bit about OpenSSL, you might be able to at least test this code example he has and give us a little bit of input here. Even better, look at the code and try to figure out how to actually fix the bug. Stuff like this is extremely helpful to us. All right. What else can you do? You can help us with the documentation. We have this super awesome new interface for editing DocBook. With a warning. You can log in as anonymous, or I can log in as me. Doesn't matter. And you'll also notice in the documentation. If you go anywhere in the manual, there's a little edit link that will take you to the page in here, in the doc editor. So if you're browsing the manual, you see a mistake, you can click the edit link. It'll take you to this doc editor, which is a crap load of JavaScript that takes a little while to load over this slow connection, it looks like. But have a look at it on your own browser. It's kind of neat. You still need to know DocBook XML. But mostly you can look at other pages and you can see the tags. It's not that hard. It's just XML. It's not that hard to figure out. Here's what it looks like. You can browse through. You can find the files. So this other one is going to take me directly to the right page in the docs. Anyway, play with that. The wiki is a good place to also keep up to date on what we're discussing. The various RFCs are in here in the request for comments. We have some to-do lists. If you're looking for bigger things to work on, have a look at our to-dos. In here, we'll have a bunch of RFCs that look at different things that we're discussing. Some that are in draft mode, a bunch of things that have been accepted. Like traits went through this whole process. It took about 3 years because it was a huge feature. But basically, this Stefan guy sat down and wrote this very nice long RFC on how traits should work, all the different properties of traits. It's also a great place to go to get really in-depth information about some of the new features, because you have this huge document that basically describes how this thing, what motivated it, where it came from, what problems it solves, how it's solving it. And at the bottom, there will also always be some discussion about drawbacks and things as well. Although I don't see it on this particular one. Discussions here. Graphs, other things. Anyway. So please contribute. Please do what you can to help us not waste too much time on other things, especially in the bug database. It would be very nice if we got some help there. Also, if you're not on 5.3 yet, please get onto 5.3. We're not fixing bugs like hash DOS and all these things in 5.2. So if you're still on 5.2, you're vulnerable to the hash DOS attack today. And there are new security things coming out in the next month or so, specifically targeting 5.2. Because the security guys have been going through and looking at things we've been changing in 5.3 and 5.4. And they go, that's interesting. We don't see a commit to 5.2, which is true. We're not patching 5.2 anymore. Some of the distros will backport security fixes in 5.3 back to 5.2. we don't have the bandwidth to go backporting back forever in the various versions you guys might be running. There's still people running 5.0, released like 30 years ago. Right? So get on 5.3, test 5.4 now. We're just about ready to release it, so it's a little late in the game even to test 5.4, but better late than never. And hopefully I've left a little bit of time for some questions. Yes, not long though. So, questions, folks. 5 minutes. Yes?
You mentioned earlier when you were showing the early version of PHP, you referred that to like more complicated class structure, what's going on.
Yes.
Give me some good examples where people go down the wrong path that overcomplicate.
Okay, so the question was, I mentioned that I preferred the earlier procedural style of PHP 2 versus the much more object-oriented PHP 4 and 5 style. And what are some of the pitfalls of making things too complicated? Many times I read code where it's just a huge list of classes, and each class has a big doc block, and then the class content itself, the body of a method inside the class, is like one line. Like return $this property, right? Why? And you have this huge file that's like 800 lines long with all these getters and all these little tiny things that do absolutely nothing, that are completely pointless because you can fetch a property from a class without any function call, right? You don't need any of that. So many times I really try hard to figure out where's the actual code. You scroll and you scroll and you scroll and scroll, and finding the code in some of these things is impossible. In a nice straight procedural style, that same bit of thing that does exactly the same thing would probably be written in 15 lines of code. And some of the object-oriented solutions I see is like 8 files, 500 lines of code. But yeah, it's more proper correct. But damn, I don't have time for reading all that crap usually. And it's also so much slower because if you really do need 8 different files with all this stuff, it's a lot of extra stats. It's lots of extra work to do. So. But I'm also old. I think about cycles at the assembly level, right? I mean, I look at a piece of C code, and I think about how many cycles is this going to take versus a slightly different piece of C code. How many cycles is that going to take? Which is completely outdated, and it's stupid because computers are so fast these days. It doesn't matter if it's 8 cycles or 12 cycles. It used to matter. It matters. It mattered in the 80s. It really mattered. It doesn't matter so much anymore, but it's really hard to get away from being that close to the machine, being that close to the CPU. You always think about things that way. So I can't really argue that my way is better. It's just how I feel about it. Others? Yes? The future of PHP 6. Right now, there is no PHP 6 on the horizon at all. We'll get there eventually. We went down a Unicode path that didn't go too well. It got too complicated, got too heavy, got too slow. We relied too much on ICU, I think, although there isn't really a better alternative for doing all the complicated Unicode stuff out there. But one of the problems is ICU is so big and heavy. We added basically a little bit of PHP to ICU versus the other way around, right? Lines of code-wise, ICU is 10x probably number of lines of code that's in PHP. So it wasn't adding a little bit of ICU to PHP. It was the other way around. And it was just too big a leap. And also all the changes that needed to be made, it just didn't work. So I'm not sure how we're going to attack the Unicode problem yet. I'm hoping for a white knight with a very fast Unicode library that's tiny. I don't see how that's going to happen because the world is a complicated place. Languages are stupid. It's one of these really, really, really hard problems. And there are some languages, spoken languages, that are just, few people speak them, and the amount of code that you need to have in your system to handle them, it'd be easier if we just killed off some of these populations. It'd be cheaper. That's obviously not going to happen, but it's just really, really hard to get full Unicode in there and still maintain speed. So I don't know. We're going to try to take small steps. A lot of the features that are outside of Unicode, well, every feature outside of Unicode that were planned for PHP 6 are now in PHP 5.4. We'll have a 5.5, which is going to be another step towards things. And then we'll see. At some point, we'll have enough changes in the pipeline that are big enough to warrant a 6. But if it doesn't include some better approach to Unicode, I'm not quite sure what the point is. So we have to see. We have made some steps towards Unicode, and I'm sure Davey will talk a bit about that in your talk. No? Okay. Okay. But there are some changes in 5.4 that make Unicode. For example, there's a multi-byte option for the Zend engine, which you had to compile for previously. Now you can set that as a runtime configuration. That makes the MB string extension much more powerful. HTML special chars, entities, and a bunch of these functions now work much better with Asian character sets, for example. So there's a bunch of fixes that are Unicode related that are basically taking the existing Unicode implementation and making it more capable in 5.4. But it's not full Unicode yet. Others? Can't see, yes.
What's the stupidest bug report you've ever seen?
The stupidest bug report? I don't know, there are so many of them. I should have a hall of fame for these things, but it's also not nice to embarrass people on it. But I mean, we get lots of just straight syntax errors. Why doesn't this work, right? And they forgot a semicolon, they did something stupid. Others mix up various types of encoding. They try to base64 decode something that's rot13, or I don't know. There's a bunch of things like that, just very, very basic stuff that if they had just thought a little bit about it, they wouldn't have filed the bug. I'm sure I'll come up with a better one, but I can't think of any right now. Yeah?
What about the scariest bug report?
Scariest bug report. Those are usually the security ones, where some of these security bug reports, they always start off very, very grand. It's like, this breaks everything. And usually after a while, thinking about it, go, wait a second. It really only breaks in certain conditions and certain systems, blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, anything where there's any sort of remote code execution possibility, like when we screwed up our max input vars implementation in 5.3.9, that wasn't good, right? Those are the scary ones, because if it's an across the board, every PHP server out there has a remote code execution flaw. That's the scariest one, where it's just, oh man, now we have to just drop everything. And it's not easy, because it's not our full-time job, any of this stuff. It means that we stop whatever people are actually paying us to do to fix stuff so that your web servers are secure. It's always an interesting dilemma sometimes. Like, well, screw it. I have other things to do right now than that, but it's the way it is. Yeah, at the back.
Is the web developer server a step towards replacing Apache?
No, okay, so the question was, is the built-in web server a step towards replacing Apache? No, never, 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 never. I think the best Apache replacement, if you're looking for an Apache replacement, is Nginx with PHP FPM that we introduced in 5.3. PHP FPM is a very, very nice, fast CGI process management mechanism that takes all the cool things in Apache that manages processes, that you can say, spin up this many Apache children, max this many, minimum this many, and have all these things, all the Apache process management has now been embedded inside PHP as of PHP 5.3. So to me, that's the best alternative to Apache, if you're for some reason looking for an alternative. Apache 2.4 just came out as well with a bunch of improvements to it, and PHP works almost perfectly fine with it. There's one little configuration patch that we need to put in, but other than that, PHP and Apache 2.4 works nicely as well. So try that too. Am I running out of time? Is that what you're coming? Tell me? Okay. Ah, you have a mic. Good.
Are there any plans in the future or near future we're going to add some kind of declaring strict data type in PHP? For example, if you declare integer, it has to be integer, it can't be changed to anything else.
Right, so I touched on it, so you guys heard that, right? It's the strict typing question. No, PHP is not a strictly typed language. There are plenty of strictly typed languages in the world. If you want strictly typed, use a strictly typed language. It doesn't make any sense because the web is not typed, right? Everything that comes across in the web request is a string. If you have an age field, there's no way of telling the server that this is a numeric field, that this will always be a number. It's always going to come across as a string. So everything you get, everything you start to work with is a string, and that trickles down into all the functions. As soon as you introduce strict typing of scalar types like that, it'll trickle up the call stack, which means that you now have to cast. Every time you call a library function, you have to worry about, oh crap, I better cast this, right? And that shouldn't be your problem. You should just be able to take this $age, post age, and feed it to the library function that does check age, right? It shouldn't be your job as the caller to cast that age to an integer. You can, obviously, in the library function, you can be strict if you want. There's nothing that prevents you from checking the type. You just want it much more convenient to check the type. But you can check the type of the incoming parameter, and you can throw an error. You can throw an exception and say, hey, this call only takes integers. And you can be an ass about it that way if you really want to, right? Nothing stops you from doing that today. We don't want to encourage that for the scalar types because it's not needed. So I don't see that ever happening in PHP. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered, when or which point in time did you notice that PHP had really taken off from the humble beginnings to knowing that, wow, this is really going somewhere? And also, what are the key highlights you've seen in its evolution along the way?
Right, so I mean, it was pretty obvious very early that PHP was something that seemed to just kind of click with people. They would figure out that, hey, this kind of works. This solves the problem the way I like solving problems. And part of that, I think, was it really appealed to the non-programmers out there that ended up tasked with solving the web problem. And a lot of programmers, especially in the early days of the web, did not take the web seriously. This was a toy, this is a fad, it's going to go away, this is not serious programming, it's scripting, it's weird, not interested, right? So in a lot of companies, their first foray into the web was, hey, let's put up a website. What do we put on it? Well, let's put our documentation for our product or our services online. So where's our technical documentation team? Well, that's our team of technical writers over here. Hey, you guys are now the web team. Yoo-hoo, great. Word, save as HTML, done, right? Push it to the web server, problem solved. Next step, though, is management comes and says, okay, well, let's put our inventory database online so people can check if our stuff is actually there, or our partners, our clients can log in. So put a login system together. They can log in, they can check inventory, they can order stuff. Technical writers go, since you're now our web team. And they look at Microsoft Word, save as authenticated database connected website, doesn't exist, right? So the fact that they could take static web pages, add a little bit of PHP magic tags to it, and have those start down towards the path. And there were many code examples. Just copy and paste a login system. So copy and paste this blob into your static HTML file that you saved with Word. Hey, now you authenticate, and it connects to a database. Here's the database. You download it from here. You install it this way. You run these 3 commands, and hey, you're done. Right? You don't really need to know what a database is or really know what programming was. You just pasted this blob. And once that first little thing works, you say, hey, we now have a database. We now can connect. We can do all these things. Then people start to learn a little bit. They start down the path of getting there. And I think that's what really drove PHP. And that's when I saw that trend happening, I could see there was just no stopping this, because there's a lot more non-programmers in the world than programmers. Of course, now 18 years later, every programmer in the world is programming web stuff. So now there's way more hammers out there. There are way more people interested in this problem. Back then, there was nobody interested in this problem. And highlights along the way? I don't know. I don't know. It's not like it's me. It's not mine. It's not sort of personal highlights. It's more It's a community of folks that have built this, right? Even in the early days, it was me and other people solving the problem, and we sort of collaborated, and we built this in a collaborative fashion. So I was just the first guy there, right? That doesn't mean much. It's like being the first guy who shows up to a party. It doesn't make the party that great. It kind of makes that guy kind of lame as well, right? The party gets going because everybody else joins in, and they build something great. And to me, I think that's the highlight. It's the community that's been built around it over the years, and watching that community grow and spawn out into all these different directions. Look at the Drupal community, for example. Those guys are crazy. They do all kinds of weird stuff, and they'll have conferences like this that are 3 times bigger of all Drupal guys, right? And then you have tons of other communities that have sprung up around it. So to me, that's the big highlight, I think. Done? Okay. Thank you very much.